This story is called All Too Familiar, a fiction by J. Robert King, published in March 10th, 2000 in Dragon Magazine number 269. My master was brilliant and righteous, a perfect murderer. He had to be brilliant to fool everyone about what he was really doing. He had to be righteous to fool himself. Make no mistake, though, he was a murderer. "The spell will save us all," he said. His white eyebrows glowed in the greenish fire of the cauldron. In withered fingers he clutched his staff. It sparked magic as he stirred it through the brew. "Death stalks every man, even young men like you, Corey." He smiled kindly at me, and his lashes battered as though they were patting me on the shoulder. "But perhaps not after tonight." "Yes, Master Bellius," I said dutifully. I was eager to please. This sulphurous laboratory was no palace, and my woven mat in the corner was no feather bed, but they were better than sleeping beneath the canal bridge. "Death and I are on a first-name basis." That seemed to startle the old sorcerer. Rumpled eyelids drew back from blood-crazed eyes. He glared at me. "You know nothing of death. Starvation isn't death. It is failure. A knife in the back isn't death. It's a betrayal. Those deaths can be avoided by a wise man." "Yes, Master Bellius." A faraway look came to his face. He stared at the stone wall as though he saw a spectre behind it, drifting inevitably nearer. "True death is the gradual erosion of time. Even a wise man cannot escape true death." He took a shuddering breath, and then smiled vaguely. "Until now." With a glance at the tray in my hands, he said, "Put the hearts down there." The tray held 12 baby turtle hearts, harvested moments before by yours truly. During my canal days, I'd learned to trap and slaughter and cook turtles, all for want of food. It was nobler still to harvest them for immortality. That's what Master Bellius had told me. I was all too willing to believe. I set the tray down on the table beside the cauldron. "Place them one at a time in the brew," he instructed, still stirring. In red fingers, I reverently lifted the warm mussels and slid them into the cauldron. As each entered, light fled deep in the mixture, and air mounted up in viscous bubbles. The master's attention turned toward the potion. "They live 250 years, those turtles. Each heart is a quarter millennium. 12 hearts are 3,000 years. "Yes, master," I replied, "but 3,000 years is not immortality." His lips drew back in a smile like a set of chisels. "This is only the start. There are older creatures still," he said as I slipped the final heart into the cauldron. "Fetch the bucket." I retreated across the dark tower, pausing at a pitcher and basin to wash the blood from my hands. At my request, the master had arranged for this station, even enchanting the water to remain ever pure. He glanced impatiently over his shoulder and shook his head. "That's why I chose you, you know, Corey. Of all the vagrants, only you were clean. And I thought, if he can keep himself clean, he can keep my laboratory clean." And it was true. The room had been in an absolute shambles when I'd first arrived. Master Bellius had been unable to find any of his specimens. I had brought order out of chaos. "But your fastidiousness is still damned annoying." Drying my hands, I lifted a pail filled with wriggling white worms. They squirmed beneath my knuckles as I approached the cauldron. "Why worms? They're not long-lived." "These worms are," Master Bellius said. He extended a knife to me. "Cut them up, Corey." I repeatedly drew the knife blade through the rolling mound, slicing as many of the vermin as I could with each pass. They did not bleed, not even white ooze. As soon as each wound was struck, it sealed itself, and the two halves of the creature wriggled away from each other. "That's how they reproduce," Master Bellius explained. "They do not couple, as we do. They split themselves, and each half grows. They do not die. Each worm in that bucket is hundreds of thousands of years old." Setting his staff aside, he took the knife from my hand and grasped the bucket handle. He poured the slimy, squirming things into the cauldron. The liquid seemed to come alive. Its surface boiled with dark power. "One sip of this brew, and I and any mortal can live for hundreds of thousands of years." "Yes, master," I watched, wide-eyed. Years ago, it had seemed my life would not last even days longer. Now before me bubbled an elixir that promised eternal life, or nearly so. But even hundreds of thousands of years is not an eternity. He stared hard at me. To give mortal flesh true immortality, Corey, I would have to sacrifice something that was immortal. I nodded, smiling. You would have to sacrifice a god. Or, Bellius replied, a human soul. I looked up just in time to see the knife tip as it entered my eye. Then there was blindness, and the awful sound of metal punching through bone, and the hot ooze of brain. And then I was dead. It's tough to live on the streets when you're an orphan. It's easy when you're a cat. Master Bellius had been right, you see, about the immortality of the soul, but he'd been wrong about being able to sacrifice it. While he plunged my corpse into his elixir, my soul fled away to the eternal wheel. While he poured the potion down his throat, I poured my soul into a new body. Master Bellius walked away from that night young and virtually immortal. I walked away feline and strikingly tortoiseshell. In some ways, he'd done me a favour. As a human, I'd been lowest of the low. Reincarnated as a tomcat, I was a king. Every tomcat is a king. It's our birthright. That's the great irony. Humans think they rule the world, but most humans don't even rule themselves. They live in big, powerful societies, but are individually weak. Only a few people rule and everyone else is ruled. Only a few feast and the rest starve. The king has 10 wives, and the wretch under the bridge hasn't even one. Master Bellius was one of the rulers, and so he thought everyone wanted to live forever. I'd been one of the outcasts, and I knew most people simply wanted to live right now. As a cat, everything was different. Every tomcat is a society of one, a kingdom unto himself. The world is his banquet, and he feasts on whatever he finds. Every alley is his royal promenade, and every balcony waits a kitty in heat. Of course, there are fights. Fights every night, or twice a night, or 3 times. But what's the point of having those needle teeth and razor claws and meaty shoulders and spiky hackles, except to fight? For a tomcat, fighting is as much fun as mating. I was king, and the city of Toril was mine, from the canal bridge to the royal palace, and even to the tower of brilliant, righteous, murderous Bellius. Since my death, young sorcerer Bellius had become a philanthropist. He'd drunk only a cupful of his immortality elixir, decanting the rest into small bottles. In his new youthful form, he'd carried the stuff to the king and the nobles, the scholars and priests. Old men and women became young again. The whole benevolent leadership of Toril regained its youth and gained immortality anew. Never again need the vagrants under the canal bridge fear that the good king might die. Never again need the poor folk pine that the brilliance of the scholars might be lost in death, or the righteousness of the priests be snuffed by the hand of God. Master Bellius had even saved 1 bottle of his elixir, half a bottle, really, with enough chunks of heart and worm to prevent a healthy quaff, and poured it into the central well. It was perhaps enough to grant a few serfs an extra year. All these benefits Sorcerer Bellius had purchased for the reasonable price of 12 baby turtle hearts, 1,000 eternal worms, and 1 young vagrant. What could be more righteous than sacrificing 1 man to save a nation? Bellius had fooled everybody, even himself. I intended to point out his error. It was a beautiful spring morning in Toril where I set out to get my revenge. Dew lay thick on the river banks, wagons creaked through the market. Yesterday's catch filled a rubbish cart where new crates of fish were opened on the cobbles. I had my pick of day-old fish. What a banquet! Afterward, I knocked down a tabby just for fun and made my way towards the royal palace. I strolled up a crumbling wall, leapt to the bowing shingles above, and followed the roof peaks, the cat's highway. Overcrowding and dilapidation made for human misery, but they were the stuff of feline heaven. Most of the roofs I crossed were too rotten to hold human weight, which kept them from chasing me off. The crooked chimneys were fire hazards for those who lived below, but were warm shoulder scratches for a cat on his way to royalty. The mice nesting in the thatch provided snacks along the way. The rainwater that dripped slowly onto sick beds allowed me a placid drink. Gables loomed low over human heads but lifted cat paws 3 stories high. I leapt from building to building. The narrow, crooked lanes below were narrower and crookeder aloft. Where there was no better route, I crossed with impunity into another Tom's territory, marked with a jealous reek. Occasionally the offended cat would challenge me. It made no matter. I had the trick of rearing up on my hind legs, man-like, and hissing ferociously. That one always scared off natural cats and convinced other reincarnated humans to let me pass. Soon the welcoming rankle of the slums gave way to the royal district. I slid down a rain trough, jumped to the ground, and dashed up the mossy buttress of the district wall. It was a grim stone bulwark, grim for the soldiers who spent long hours pacing there, but a glad place for a nimble cat. I vaulted from battlement to battlement, pounced once in the centre of a guardhouse dice match, and scampered out atop the garrison building. Down across the parade grounds I reached the King's Cathedral. Aerial bridges and flying buttresses gave me easy access to the castle beyond. The King's Castle was a dreamy structure, festooned with gargoyles and statuary. I skipped lightly across the stone heads of the past monarchs, pausing for a quick lick-down within one coronet. I was still fastidious. Just over my head, the masons had kindly set a 6-inch ledge of stone that ran the whole facade. It was like a royal road. I trotted along it to an ancient tower overrun with ivy. It was the oldest part of the palace and housed generations of sorcerers, the power behind the throne. The tower windows were small and choked with leaves except for the topmost one. There, brimstone and noxious smoke had kept the ivy more trim. That was where Bellius had his laboratory. That was where I would begin my ploy. I climbed. The vines were so thick around the tower it seemed a giant scratching post. In moments, I had reached the crumbling windowsill. I scrambled onto it and was grateful that Bellius was nowhere to be seen. I studied the battlefield. Bellius's laboratory was an absolute wreck. Grimy walls sported colonies of moss, rafters dangled cobweb curtains. Across the dusty tabletop, jars of grotesque specimens lay in disarray. Unidentified stains covered the floor. My mat still in the corner by the stairs, though now it was a bed only for mould. The ghost image of my body remained in the woven reeds. That was the reason I was here. Vengeance for the creature I used to be. I leapt to the floor. Through my pads I sensed tingling energy. Despite Master Bellius's rigorous neglect, he still maintained a magical alarm in his laboratory. I would only have a few moments before he arrived. I began on the cluttered table. Lifting vials with my teeth, I placed them in alphabetical order on the component shelves. A few quick swipes of my tail dusted the shelves and a few more cleaned the tabletop. Next, I leapt into the rafters and ran their length, gathering cobwebs on my fur. Back on the windowsill, a few simple shakes sent most of the dust wafting out into the spring air. The rest disappeared when I slipped into the pitcher of ever-pure water. Gingerly crawling out, I leapt to the floor and raced wall to wall like a wet mop. Where I went, stains and soot were purified. Soon the stones sparkled. Lapping up more of the water, I hissed it out across the mouldy walls. Mildew faded away. All that remained was the mat with my image imprinted on it. That I could not bear to clean, so I rolled it up and hid it in the corner. The filth of the whole year was cleaned in mere moments. The ever-pure water made me clean too. By the time anxious footsteps came to the stairs and the door barked open, I sat placidly in the centre of Master Bellius's massive lab table. Master Bellius stood there, framed in the dark doorway, and glared at me. He was much changed. Young and strong, with bright blue eyes, smooth skin, and a shock of black hair. He wore clean white robes and carried a slender, silvery staff, quite a contrast to the gnarled branch he used to wield. All in all, he looked like a different person, suited for royal ballrooms instead of old, dark, albeit clean, laboratories. Still, I knew it was him. I recognized the murderous fury in his bulging eyes. I blissfully stretched. Bellius's gaze shifted from me to the clean tabletop and the orderly specimens ranked behind me. He looked down at the floor, mopped to an impressive shine, and then up to the rafters, cleaned as well. Anger became confusion. He blinked, scratching his head. Like a man testing ice, Bellius set the tip of his staff on the clean floor and shoved a little. His feet tentatively followed the staff out. He picked his way carefully across the room. "Hello, Tom," he said softly, creeping toward me, one hand outstretched. "What sort of a strange phantasm are you?" I rose and meowed through a purr, arching my back for him to stroke. He did not. I should have expected it. Master Bellius was, after all, a murderer. In vice-like fingers, he grabbed the scruff of my neck and hoisted me into the air. People say that doesn't hurt are idiots. I was strangling, hanging there, my feet kicking uselessly beneath me. No phantasm at all, but a flesh and blood beast, he said, studying me, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. A familiar, perhaps? A laboratory helpmate? A tidy cat for an untidy sorcerer? Maybe, but you might also be a rival in disguise here to steal my secrets. He strode to the window and shoved me out of it, dangling there. There's one way to see. Aren't cats always supposed to land on their feet? Still in his grip, I spun desperately, trying to get a claw on the windowsill. The bastard flung me away. I shrieked. Air whirled around me. Ears over tail, I toppled. There wasn't a damn scrap of thatch for miles. Not a haystack, not a moat. No, just a couple of inches of grass over loamy ground. My tail spun like a maple seed and I levelled out. My legs stretched down beneath me and my backbone arched, springs to cushion my landing. Still, it was 6 stories down, enough to wound if not kill. I landed with a thud. My legs shattered. The ground wasn't through with me. I rolled half a dozen times before I lay there, broken and still. The wind was knocked out of me and my legs were in agony. I struggled to rise but couldn't. I cursed my cockiness. I'd been sure Bellius would take me as a familiar, allow me near enough to exact my revenge. Instead, he'd only killed me once more. Master Bellius's boots drummed the ground rapidly as he approached. I expected more hands on my throat, this time wringing my neck. Instead, Master Bellius lifted me gently, almost cradling me in his arms. I thought you were a sorceress spy, Tom. I had to test you. But you're only a cat. A smart, beautiful, clean cat. It's only fitting that a mage of my standing has so clever, so tidy a familiar. He strode back to the laboratory, his restless eyes tracing out my broken form. Fear not, Tom, I have magics to set your legs. Then there are a few more spots that need cleaning. Despite the agony in my legs, I knew I had him. I knew I had him. I was the happiest creature in Toril. Sure, I had taken a 60-foot plunge, broken 2 legs, endured an inexpert healing session at the hand of a monomaniacal mage, and become the virtual prisoner of a murderer. A human in my position would have been in misery. But cats don't do misery, we do revenge. The morning after my fall, I was as good as new. Even the last twinges were gone from my legs. I explored the chamber. Yes, I had known the place as a human, but no adult human really knows any place. You have to crawl everywhere you can crawl, lick anything interesting, trace all the smells to their sources, listen to ants trooping across the walls, and eat a few spiders before you really know a place. After age 8, most humans are incapable of such explorations. My motives were reasonable. Idle curiosity, of course, but also a mental accounting of all the resources available for exacting my revenge. I perused the countless vials of poison. It would have been an easy thing to put a poison tack on Bellius's chair and watch him die when he next sat. Easy, but not very clever. Next, I checked over the block and tackle in the rafters. Bellius used it to move heavy equipment, but I could fashion a noose on one end and attach a counterweight to the hook on the other. No, too much orchestration. I turned my attention to cleaning and sorting the master's collection of scalpels. A fitting vengeance would include a poke in the eye. Perhaps when he took a nap some afternoon, I'd visit him with an ice pick. Nah, that wasn't my style. Better to have him kill himself. I moved on to the mineral jars. Many of the labels were loose. A few assiduous swaps, say on the brimstone, charcoal and nitrate jars, could make for an explosive combination. The problem was that I had to get out alive too. So many possibilities. There's no happier creature than a cat plotting revenge. The problem was, night after night, Bellius seemed less deserving of retribution. He spent his days at court in the never-ending cycle of celebrations that was Toril government. He had every reason to be happy, young, rich, eternally free, occupied only with feasts and dances and plays. But he was miserable. His newfound life had lost its luster. Every night Bellius retired, bleary and defeated, to his laboratory. He was glad to have my company, and supposedly a sympathetic ear. Oh, Tom, you don't know what a bore it is to be immortal, Bellius muttered, dropping into a seat near his desk and giving a gusty sigh. I lifted my head, yawned luxuriantly, and stretched my claws. Even in his young, smooth face, the master's eyes looked old. They glowered like cracked granite. You've heard people say, care to make it interesting. Then they put down a bet. Suddenly any minuscule event becomes interesting. Suddenly it matters which stick reaches the waterfall first, or which icicle drips next, or which side of a die points up. Risk. It's what makes things interesting. He blinked at me, staring at me. What risk do I have? None. What interests do I have? None. I sauntered slowly over towards him, considering his words. He was right. He had nothing to fear, nothing to accomplish, nothing to care about. I had planned to leap on his lap and get a back rub. Even an enemy can give a good back rub. But got distracted by a ladybug. I crouched down, my hind legs working excitedly and my tail twitching. I sacrificed everything to gain immortality. I frowned. He sacrificed everything? I even became a murderer, he confessed heavily. His eyes were haunted. I killed a kindly young lad, sacrificing his life for my spell. He's in a better place now, but I'm caught in this eternal hell. He was right about that as well. My feline life was better than anything I'd had as a human. Once I ran through these 9 lives, there'd be another one, and another. Master Bellius, meanwhile, was stuck with immortal boredom. The ladybug took flight. I leapt after her. She cracked her hard little head on the wall and fluttered upward. Oh, I wanted that bug. Clicking sounds escaped my mouth. My muscles bunched to leap once more, again and again. Master Bellius watched me and shook his head. You're a happy thing, aren't you, Tom? Animals are different. They don't need risk. Desire and satiation and endless cycles. That's all you need. You've got that glad, pure, natural heart. The last word came out as a revelation. His long sighs gave way to quick breaths. Granite eyes melted to magma. I let the ladybug slip away into the rafters and glanced at Master Bellius. His nostrils flared, as if he were a predator smelling the scent of dinner. If I can steal immortality from another creature, why can't I steal happiness? He rubbed his hands avidly. The immortal soul of Corey and the boundless happiness of Tom, all rolled together. He surged up from his chair, reaching for me. I followed the ladybug to the rafters. It's amazing the vertical leap a cat can take when death is on the line. I'd been through this scene once before with Master Bellius, and I wasn't about to let him murder me twice. Hackles high, back arched, eyes and mouth open, I stared down at my master. It's all right, Tom, Bellius said, lunging again. I skipped across the beams, stumbling for a moment on the pulley, and escaped to the far edge of the roof. Come here, kitty kitty, he urged, closing and bolting the door that left only the window. I scrambled towards it, but Bellius was quicker, hurling the lab table to cover the gap. He braced the heavy wood in place. I couldn't move that table. I couldn't unbolt that door. The room, I knew all too well, had no other exits. Master Bellius laughed dryly. That's right, Tom, you stay up there. I have a few preparations to make, and then I'll just put you to sleep, he said, waving his hand hypnotically before his face. He was going to cut out my heart, my happy little feline heart, and there was no way to stop him. In fact, if I didn't calm down immediately, he would probably put me to sleep right away, and that would be the end of it for Tom. Sighing nervously, I crouched down atop a beam, took a placid breath, and thought. What made me think I could outsmart Master Bellius? He was brilliant. I was a cat. That was the problem with humans. Too smart to let anybody else live and too righteous to enjoy life themselves. They fooled every other creature into believing they ruled the world and then fooled themselves into believing it too. The fact was, they ruled nothing at all. Suddenly, I understood. Bellius didn't really control the situation. After all, I was the damned cat. First, I had to come down out of the rafters. Why should I skulk? This wasn't going to be my death. It was Bellius's. How could I get revenge if I crouched up there like some vagrant? I landed lightly on the top shelf of the specimen rack. Glass jars chimed. Bellius whirled. Behind him, a fresh-lit brazier glowed evilly. The orange light painted his dark brows in a horrible aspect. His eyes bulged. Feigned affection drew like a tattered veil across his face. Hello, Tom. Now there's a good cat. His hands tensed, rising to grab me. Not wanting to begin the chase all over, I snatched up a small bag of brimstone and jumped to the floor, trotting confidently to the edge of the brazier. I tossed the bag atop the smouldering coals. In a poof of smoke, the fire redoubled. Bellius looked gleefully at me. You want to help? Oh, smart, Tom. He reached up to the block and tackle overhead, grabbed an iron hook and fastened it around the cauldron's handle. Rope paid through the pulley as he hoisted the cauldron. It swung above gleaming coals. The cauldron settled with a crackling sound atop them. Bellius unhooked the rope and stowed it above. He returned to the kettle. His hands moved in a deft pattern over it, as though he were opening folds in the air. In fits and bursts, water fell from his fingers into the cauldron, where it hissed and jumped. Soon the kettle was half full, and Bellius folded back the seams he had opened. I had been busy myself. I knew which components Bellius commonly used in his elixirs: filters of stoat blood and whale oil, pouches of ground lizard bone and sun-dried chicken eyes, skulls large and small, and I fetched them one by one. Since the table had been overturned, I lined up those items on the floor, just out of Bellius's reach. It was all part of my ploy. My work would reassure him, put him at ease, and give him plenty of things to be distracted by. Between trips to the components rack, I detoured through the rafters and shifted the block and tackle into the best configuration. I also darted along the lab table that was propped against the window. There was a small niche behind it, not large enough to let me escape, but large enough to serve my purposes. Soon the potion in the cauldron had reached a rolling boil. Bellius stirred with his new magic staff. Lightning mantled into it and sent jabbing fingers of power down into the brew. Over the mixture, Bellius muttered ancient and horrible words. Each syllable heightened the elixir's boil. I felt its predatory heat from the rafters, where I dragged at the rope. This concoction was devised to leach the essence from its final component. It would distill that essence into a single potent drink. Bellius intended to hurl me alive into that boiling cauldron. Moments later, when I was dead a second time, he would drink down my happiness. Or so he thought. Steam belched up from the cauldron and fogged the rafters. It made my work only easier. Bellius was so avid in his spellcasting he did not feel the hook slide into place beneath the belt of his robes. He did not notice as I looped the other end of the rope around one leg of the upended table. I let out a shriek of feigned terror and wiggled my way behind the upended table. I couldn't reach the window, of course, but Bellius didn't know that. All he knew was that his eternal happiness was about to escape out the window. With an inarticulate roar, Bellius lunged for the table, grasped its edge with his young, strong hands, and hurled it from that window. The heavy table dropped like a lovely counterweight. The rope around one leg pulled tight. Cord paid through the pulley in the rafters. The sorcerer, one-time Master Bellius, was hauled up by his belt to dangle above his own boiling cauldron. Oh, it was sweet to be a cat on the windowsill in that moment. The masks were gone. It was clear who ruled this situation. Suddenly, Bellius was neither clever enough nor righteous enough to fool anybody. Instead, he only flailed and kicked impotently, singed by the steam of his own hellish brew. I sighed a contented sigh, licked my paws, and stretched languidly. It was a familiar moment, all too familiar, except the last time I was the one who went into the pot. Jumping from the windowsill to the now level tabletop, I sashayed over to where the rope was looped. All I had to do was tug a little on that frayed end there, and Master Bellius would plunge into a boiling death. All too familiar. "Please, please, Tom, please help me," he shouted. He deserved it, certainly. He was a murderer, after all. Almost a double murderer, with me a double victim. He deserved it. But the question was, did I deserve it? If I did this, I'd be a murderer too. His score would be settled and he'd be reincarnated as a happy hamster somewhere. I'd remain alive, knowing I'd killed a villain only to become one. I looked down at the rope. One little tug. "Please, Tom, please." I washed my paws of the whole thing and turned tail. This had been revenge enough. Bellius would get himself down somehow. He'd survive this night, an eternal and unhappy villain. And I, on the other hand, would walk away, a glad cat. As I strutted through the window, Bellius stopped thrashing. Had the steam overcome him? Had he died anyway? I glanced back over my shoulder and glimpsed the last jabbing movements of his hands. He was casting a spell. I leapt for the window, but fingers of magic clutched the scruff of my neck. They dragged me away from the sill, from life, and hauled me toward the cauldron. I shrieked, wriggling, wriling, crawling, but it was no good. There were no hands to bite, no faces to scratch, only the implacable air. I spun my tail to strike the rope and knock it loose and send my tormentor into the drink, but my touch was feather light. Gripped in merciless talons of air, I floated across the laboratory and right up in front of Bellius's red, leering face. He laughed angrily. "You should have killed me when you had the chance, Tom. Mercy's for the weak." I hadn't time to disagree. The magic fist plunged me into the boiling brew. It was agony. Blistering heat peeled my flesh from my bones. Worse still was the ravenous hunger that ate away my essence. Worst of all was knowing my glad feline heart would be granted to the man who had murdered me twice. Bygones. Dogs don't believe in revenge. Dogs believe in running and sniffing and wagging and howling. I thought it'd been great to be reincarnated as a cat, and it was, but it's even better to be a dog. Cats just put up with people. Dogs genuinely love them. I'm a bird dog, small and lean. I get to spend lots of my time tromping through the woods and pointing grouse and pheasant. I can bring back a bird in my mouth without getting a single drop of drool on it. There'll just be one little blood spot where the crowl had gone in and the other where it had come out. My master is the best shot in Terraloo and a great guy. Almost a god, so wonderful he is. There's nothing better than getting a pat on the head and a good dog. Life gets better and better each time around. Master Bellius, of course, won't get another time around. He's got the curse of immortality. Yes, he survived the night. Yes, he drank the distilled essence of my former feline being. He thought he was getting happiness out of that deal, and he did. But he also got the unshakable impression that he was a cat. The king and his court were surprisingly intolerant of their sorcerer's antics. Naked, he would scamper around the castle on all floors, sit on tables and lick himself down, mark his territory in the corners of the throne room, claw the ancestral tapestry to ribbons, hiss and spit at any guards who approached him, climb in people's windows at night and crawl up to sleep between their legs. The final straw had been the unspeakable things Bellius tried to do to the king's tabby, Sophia. Within a week, the immortal lunatic Master Bellius had been ousted from the castle. He's taken up residence beneath the canal bridge, just where I used to sleep. He thinks himself the king of the world, of course. He's just a madman. But he's happy. Happier than any murderer deserves to be. Yes, dogs don't believe in revenge, but we do believe in chasing cats. And cats, or for that matter, former sorcerers who think they are cats, believe in running from dogs. This is a nice arrangement. Every chance I get, I head down to the canal bridge to nose up my old master and chase him around town.